The building on fire, I'm trapped inside, me and my man.
Yo, this man screaming for help online.
The internet is filled with creepy content, but some videos go beyond disturbing, like this one, for example. It's 9 a.m. on May 18, 2024, when a thick column of black smoke begins rising over Charlotte, North Carolina. The smell of burning chemicals fills the air as residents look up and see the smoke twisting high into the sky. It's coming from a massive 7-story building, a luxury apartment complex that was still under construction, 239 upscale units that hadn't yet housed a single tenant. At first glance, the lack of residents might seem like a lucky break, but in reality, it's part of what made the situation so dangerous. The top 5 floors weren't finished. They were just exposed wooden frames and insulation, dry and unprotected. A fire didn't just have fuel, it had kindling. So when the flames broke out, they spread with terrifying speed. 17 construction workers were on site that morning. They had arrived for a regular day of work. Now, they were trapped. When the first firefighters arrived on scene, the upper levels were already consumed by flames. Crews moved fast, pulling 15 of the workers from the building. But once outside, they realized something horrifying. 2 men were still missing. Inside the smoke-choked maze of half-finished walls and collapsing beams, 2 workers, DeMonte Sherrill and Reuben Holmes, were left behind. They were trapped somewhere deep inside, and they were screaming for help. But DeMonte didn't just scream. He pulled out his phone, opened Facebook, and started a live stream.
Somebody send help, we're in South Park. Help! Yo, I'm at South Park right now, at work, the building on fire, and I can't get out.
The footage shows DeMonte and Reuben surrounded by dense smoke. You can hear the fear in their voices, but they try to stay composed. They explain where they are. On the 6th floor, the second highest level. The only stairwell is on the opposite side of the building, but something is blocking the hallway. They can't get to it. And with the fire closing in behind them, their only other option would be to jump 6 stories into what was almost certainly a sea of flames.
It's getting harder and harder for them to see us. We're gonna have to stand out here and see. The building on fire, I'm trapped inside, me and my man.
DeMonte waves his phone's flashlight toward the window, hoping someone below might catch a glimpse. He talks directly into the camera, describing their position in case rescuers are watching. But the building is massive, and the smoke is too thick. They are almost invisible, even from just a few feet away.
Yo, this building is on fire. I'm at work. Somebody send help, we're at South Park.
As the fire intensifies, DeMonte grows more desperate. He starts shouting louder, trying to make his voice rise above the roar of the flames. In the background, Reuben waves his flashlight in frantic sweeping motions. They're doing everything they can to stay alive, hoping that someone, somewhere, can find them before it's too late. Then, without warning, the live stream cuts out. Rescue crews knew where they were, at least roughly. They tried using a crane outfitted with a basket to reach the 6th floor. That crane actually appears briefly in DeMonte's live stream, though it's facing the wrong direction. The smoke was so dense that orientation became guesswork. At one point, the crane operator may have even seen them, but the heat was overwhelming and the fire was closing in fast. Moments later, the crane operator had to be rescued himself. The only remaining option was a direct rescue. Firefighters entered the building and climbed the stairwell to the 6th floor. They pushed forward through intense heat and thick, choking smoke, moving toward the far end of the structure where DeMonte and Ruben were believed to be. The fire was everywhere. The floors were starting to weaken. Still, they kept going. Then they heard it, screaming. It was faint but unmistakable. DeMonte and Ruben were still alive. But just as the team tried to move faster, a new order came through the radio.
All companies working 7741 Liberty Road Drive, evacuate structure, per command. All companies working 7741 Liberty Road Drive, evacuate structure.
Command all companies, this will be defensive at this time. We'll be ready for this side to collapse. Everybody get out of the collapse zone. Confirming you are coming out, but you're not out of the building.
All crews were told to evacuate immediately. The building was on the brink of collapse. Firefighters shouted out one final time, hoping the trapped men would come running toward the sound. But there was no response. Then, silence. The rescue team had no choice. They left the building, and just minutes later, the structure collapsed. The temperature inside had reached over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit by the time it gave way.
It collapsed.
DeMonte Sherrill and Ruben Holmes never made it out.
Yo, I'm at South Park right now, at work, and the building on fire, and I can't get out. It's getting harder and harder for them to see us.
What makes the footage even harder to watch is knowing who saw it first. Friends, family. DeMonte's own mother was watching as it happened. So was his brother, who rushed to the site and begged firefighters to use the live stream to help find them.
This man screamed for help online.
But there was simply too much working against the rescuers. Too little time, too much fire. In the investigation that followed, officials discovered that the crew had been using an organic foam insulation known for being extremely flammable and for producing thick, toxic smoke. The machine used to spray it had caught fire, and with no smoke detectors or alarm systems installed yet, no one knew the fire had started until it was already too late. Tragically, there had also been a temporary staircase located exactly where DeMonte and Ruben had been trapped, but it had just been removed to make way for the permanent one. As a result of these failures, the construction companies involved were fined $50,000 and are now facing lawsuits from the families. But no amount of money will ever make up for what happened that day. Because nothing can bring back DeMonte Sherrill or Ruben Holmes. It's heartbreaking to think that some lives end this way, and sadly, the same can be said about the next video. It was 2:46 p.m. when the ground began to shake.
Knock it off.
For the residents of Anagawa, Japan, earthquakes were a familiar occurrence. But this one was different. It struck with a kind of violence that none of the locals had ever experienced before. And when the tremors finally stopped, everyone stood frozen, staring out at a world that had just changed in an instant. This was especially true for a group of nearly 160 Chinese workers and students who had recently moved to the area. Most of them had never experienced an earthquake before, certainly not one of this magnitude. Among them was a tight-knit group of 20 women, newly hired as trainees at a seafood processing company called Sato Susan. They had been working when the quake struck and immediately rushed outside, panicked and disoriented, standing in the street and trying to figure out what to do next. What they didn't realize was that the worst hadn't even begun yet. In Japan, the earthquake is only half the danger. The other half is the tsunami that often follows. And typically, the stronger the quake, the more devastating the wave. Anagawa was right on the coast, and the Sato Susan facility sat directly on the shoreline, which meant that these women were now standing in the path of what was quickly becoming an oncoming catastrophe. Thankfully, their boss, Mitsuo Sato, knew exactly what was coming. He immediately shouted for the women to run to higher ground, but knowing that they weren't familiar with the area, he realized he couldn't just give instructions. He had to lead them. The women followed without hesitation as Sato guided them up a staircase carved into the side of a nearby hill. It led to a small shrine overlooking Anagawa and the sea, one of the highest points in the area. From there, they should have been safe. And yet, as they neared the top, the ocean began to behave in ways that confirmed Sato's fears. The water had suddenly pulled far away from the shore, and now it was rushing back in. What came next wasn't just dangerous, it was apocalyptic. Still, Sato didn't stop. Once he was confident the group had reached a safe enough altitude, he turned and began walking back down toward the town. The women shouted after him, asking where he was going. That's when he told them. His wife and daughter were still down there, in their home, directly in the tsunami's path, and he was going to save them. The women screamed for him to stay. They pleaded with him not to go back. But Sato didn't even look back. He stepped onto the street and vanished from view. One of the women, standing at the top of the hill, began recording. The footage shows that the shoreline was gone. Water had surged in, swallowing the streets and creeping deeper and deeper into the town. The women's voices tremble with panic as they record what's happening, calling out for Sato over and over again. But he doesn't respond. He's somewhere down there, lost in the chaos. As the desperation in their voices grows, so too does the force of the water. All they can do is watch as Anagawa is slowly erased. Buildings vanish. Cars are swept away. Entire neighborhoods disappear beneath a churning sea. And it's at this moment that the women realize something terrible. The height they've reached might still not be enough. So they start running again, climbing even higher up the hillside. And as they do, they see something that stops them cold. Standing on a rooftop in the middle of the flood is Mitsuo Sato. The building he's on was once 2 stories tall. Now, it's barely inches above the surface of the rising tide. The women shout his name again, frantic, pleading, but it's no use. A moment later, the camera turns away for just a second, and from the sound of the women's screams, you know exactly what just happened. The recording cuts off. When it resumes minutes later, the street where they had stood earlier is now completely underwater. The buildings are gone. In front of them is nothing but a sea of destruction. If Sato hadn't led them up that hill, every single one of those women would have died. The date was March 11, 2011, the day Japan was struck by the most powerful earthquake in its recorded history. A magnitude 9.0. It triggered a tsunami that would become the deadliest the country had ever experienced. That day, 19,759 lives were lost. Mitsuo Sato was one of them. But his wife and daughter were not. Somehow, against all odds, both were found alive and unharmed. The scale of the devastation from that day is nearly impossible to grasp. Entire towns were flattened. Nuclear reactors failed. Families were destroyed. And yet in the midst of all of it, there were stories like Sato's. Stories of people who chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. A man who saved 20 strangers by leading them to safety. A man who gave his life trying to reach the ones he loved. And it's because of those 20 women, who survived because of him, that the world now knows his name. Mitsuo Sato is remembered as a hero. And of the 160 Chinese migrants working in the area that day, not a single one was lost. That speaks volumes about the people of Anagawa, those who were willing to risk everything to save others. But what if, instead of trying to save your life, someone chooses to end it? Let's see how that horrifying scenario unfolds in the next video. It was just past 5:30 a.m. on February 17, 2021, when residents of a quiet neighborhood in Georgetown, Ontario, were startled awake by the sound of sirens piercing the early morning silence. One man rushed outside with his phone in hand, trying to capture what was happening, and what he saw was horrifying. His neighbor's home was completely engulfed in flames. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was already too late. The fire had consumed nearly everything, and there was little hope of saving anyone inside. It would take several hours before the flames were finally brought under control. Only then could investigators enter the scene, and what they found inside the charred remains of the garage sent a chill through everyone on site. The bodies of 56-year-old Christina Rack and 59-year-old Andrew Rack were discovered among the wreckage. At first, the cause of the fire was a mystery, but something about it felt off. Experts quickly determined that the fire had been triggered by some sort of explosion originating from inside the garage, right where the couple's bodies were found. That suspicion was confirmed when a neighbor handed over security camera footage. The video captured the exact moment the garage exploded, at precisely 5:27 a.m. Investigators knew they weren't dealing with an accident. But things only grew more disturbing once autopsies were performed on Christina and Andrew. The results revealed that neither of them had died in the fire. They had been murdered before it even started. Both had been stabbed multiple times, and Andrew had also been badly beaten. The fire hadn't been the weapon, it had been the cover-up. And it worked, at least for a while. The blaze had reduced the crime scene to ashes, wiping out nearly all physical evidence. But investigators still had that one lead, the surveillance footage. The camera faced the garage, and detectives hoped that if they rewound the footage far enough, they might see what had led up to the attack. So, they scrolled back, hours at a time. The garage remained still and uneventful until they reached 6:42 p.m. on the previous evening, February 16th. That was when Christina and Andrew were last seen. The video shows Christina's car pulling into the garage. Andrew was driving. Everything appears normal, just a quiet return home. But then, something deeply unsettling happens. As the car rolls into the garage, a tall figure, completely shrouded in shadow, can be seen lurking on the side of the house. The person slips in silently behind the car just before the garage door begins to close. It's impossible to tell if Andrew or Christina ever noticed him. Both begin stepping out of the vehicle as the figure ducks down, avoiding detection. Within seconds, they were both dead. The footage is haunting. It taps into a primal fear that someone could be waiting for you, hidden in plain sight, ready to strike in the place you feel safest. The attack was fast, calculated, premeditated, and the person responsible had clearly studied their routine. Whoever this was had waited until the exact moment they returned home, knowing exactly when and where to strike. But the killer's identity remained a mystery. So, investigators released a portion of the footage to the public, hoping someone might recognize the figure. It was one of the rare instances where a killer was captured on camera just moments before the crime. But even that didn't help. The figure's features were completely obscured. No face, no voice, no leads. Still, the footage confirmed one thing. The killer had known the couple. This wasn't random. It was personal. So detectives began looking into Christina and Andrew's lives. But there was no history of disputes, no known enemies, until one name surfaced: Harrison Brown. He was a 27-year-old employee at Rogue Transportations, where Christina worked as vice president of operations. Those who worked with Harrison described him as angry and difficult. Christina had reprimanded him more than once, which caused Harrison to grow increasingly hostile toward her. It's unclear exactly how police first zeroed in on him, but they soon had enough suspicion to pay his home a visit. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Inside Harrison's home, police discovered satellite images of the Rack's house and a disturbing set of tools used for tracking Christina's movements. On his computer and phone, they found software connected to a GPS tracker, one that he had secretly placed on Christina's car on February 12th. He had been following her every move for days. And that wasn't all. In Harrison's garage, investigators found a broken knife stained with traces of Christina's blood. The evidence was overwhelming. When confronted, Harrison broke down. He confessed. He said he had grown to resent Christina and had decided to take revenge. He bought the tracking device, studied her movements, and waited for the right moment. On February 16th, he hid outside the Rack's home and slipped into the garage after they pulled in. There, he stabbed and beat them to death. The next morning, fearful he had left behind evidence, he returned and set the house on fire, hoping the flames would erase everything. It didn't work. Harrison Brown pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson. He was sentenced to life in prison. And sometimes, justice does catch up, just like it did for the person in the next video. On March 30th, 2017, a disturbing video began circulating on Twitter, showing a woman hanging out of a window, clinging on for dear life with just one hand. Below her were 7 stories of open air, ending in concrete and metal, a fall that would almost certainly mean death. Understandably, the woman was sobbing, begging to be saved, crying out repeatedly, "Hold me! Hold me!" But what made this video especially unsettling wasn't just the danger she was in. It was the response she received from the person standing just inches away. Behind the camera stood another woman, calmly recording the ordeal on her phone. As the woman outside the window pleaded for her life, the person filming responded coldly, saying, "Oh, crazy, come back." It's a chilling moment. One woman helplessly dangles on the edge of death, while another stands safely inside, emotionless, doing absolutely nothing to help. And then, just as many feared, the inevitable happens. The woman loses her grip and falls. A moment later, the camera captures her lying motionless on the ground, 7 stories below. The footage was shocking, and within hours, it had spread across Twitter. Millions watched the video, asking the same question. What exactly had happened here? Why was this woman hanging from a window? Why wasn't anyone helping her? And most importantly, was this an accident or something more sinister? With no context provided, many assumed the worst, that this was a suicide attempt and that the woman filming had simply assumed she was bluffing. Perhaps she believed the woman wouldn't actually jump. Maybe she didn't realize there was nothing the woman could do to save herself once she was out that window. That theory became the dominant narrative. Countless viewers accepted that explanation and moved on, convinced that this was just another tragic moment caught on camera. But something about it didn't feel right. The cold, almost mocking way the woman behind the camera responded. It didn't feel like disbelief. It felt like contempt, as if this was exactly what she expected to happen. And eventually, the truth came out. It turned out there was more to the story. Much more. When local news sources in Kuwait began reporting on the video, the real story surfaced. The woman hanging from the window was identified as Adish Sadiq. And this was not a suicide attempt. It was an escape attempt. Because what we were witnessing on camera wasn't just desperation, it was survival. Adish, originally from Ethiopia, had come to Kuwait to work as a maid. But almost immediately after arriving, her situation turned into something far darker. She had only been working for her employer for 3 days, but during that time, she had been held against her will. She wasn't allowed to leave the apartment. She had effectively become a prisoner, a modern-day slave. Unfortunately, stories like Adish's are not uncommon in the region due to a system known as the kafala system, a sponsorship-based labor program that has been widely criticized for enabling the abuse of foreign workers. That day, Adish had finally had enough. She told her employer that she was quitting and demanded to be released. But her boss didn't take the news well. Instead, she flew into a rage, dragged Adish into a bathroom near the top floor of their building, locked the door, and began shouting that she was going to kill her. She even said that no one would care or ever find out. And Adish believed her, because she knew it was probably true. In that moment, Adish made a decision. With no way to fight back and no one coming to help, she chose the only option that gave her even a sliver of a chance. She climbed out the window. It wasn't a calculated risk. It was pure desperation. Fall, and she would probably die. Stay, and she would definitely die. But before she let go, her employer pulled out her phone and began recording. She didn't try to stop her. She didn't try to help. She stood there filming what she thought would be a woman's final moments, mocking her as she dangled. That explains the coldness, the indifference. She didn't want to stop Adish. She wanted to watch her die. Even worse, after the fall, this woman immediately uploaded the video to her Snapchat account. She wanted people to see it. When questioned, she claimed that Adish had been trying to take her own life, that she had nothing to do with what happened. It was a lie, and it almost worked. If Adish had died, it probably would have, but she didn't. Miraculously, when Adish fell, her body hit a metal awning, which broke her fall just enough to save her life. She suffered a broken arm and other injuries, but incredibly, she survived. A few days later, from her hospital bed, she gave an interview, explaining everything that had happened and revealing the truth behind the video. Her words sparked outrage, and thanks to her testimony, her employer was arrested. But despite the cruelty of what she had done, the woman was only sentenced to a few months in jail. Still, it's staggering to consider how differently this could have ended. If that video had never been recorded, or if Adish hadn't survived, the truth would have been buried forever. It would have been remembered as just another suicide. The woman behind the camera would never have faced any consequences. And Adish's story, her suffering, her courage, her will to survive, would never have been known. Thankfully, that didn't happen. For once, the victim lived to tell her side, and the world listened. But sadly, stories like this are far from rare when exploring the darker corners of the internet. The same can be said for the following video. In recent years, the popularity of live streaming has reached an all-time high, allowing audiences to engage with their favorite creators in a way that feels immediate and deeply personal. But with this level of constant connection comes an uncomfortable reality, because when the camera never stops rolling, anything can happen. And sometimes, what happens is deeply disturbing. Unsurprisingly, the internet is now filled with compilations and clips documenting moments where live streams took an unexpected and often horrifying turn. Of the countless examples that have circulated, a few have always stood out to me. One of them occurred in 2021, involving a 23-year-old woman named Chao Kui-mei. At the time, Chao had been steadily growing her following on the Chinese social media platform Douyin, the country's version of what most of us know today as TikTok. That platform will actually appear again in the remainder of today's stories. Through a mix of short videos and live streams, Chao's follower count had climbed to over 100,000. While she wasn't the most famous creator on the app, she had something many others didn't: a clear path to success. People believed she was on her way to internet stardom, but Chao knew that being an influencer wouldn't pay the bills overnight. She needed a stable job to support herself and her family, especially as the young mother of 2 children. So during the day, she worked as a crane operator, contributing to major construction projects and earning a decent living. It wasn't the kind of job most people would sign up for. The cranes she operated were often perched hundreds of feet in the air, sometimes over 1,000. It was risky, intense, and definitely not for the faint of heart. But Chao didn't seem to mind the danger. In fact, she embraced it. She used her job as a unique backdrop for her online content, filming videos from the operator's cab and pairing them with music, dances, or updates on her life. These clips, along with her dance videos, were what brought her most of her views. By the summer of 2021, Chao had started live streaming not just from home, but directly from the construction site, sometimes even while operating the crane itself. On July 20th, 2021, as her workday was winding down, she fired up another stream. It was business as usual, but this one would end differently. The full version of this live stream doesn't appear to exist online today. Instead, all that remains is a roughly 2-minute clip. It begins quietly, with Chao inside the small cab of her crane, some 160 feet in the air. She had been singing along to copyrighted music, which is likely why the original audio begins in silence. At one point, she sets her phone down with the camera still rolling. Viewers begin joining, leaving comments, enjoying the stream like always. And then, the footage cuts. The next frames are brief and jarring. While the exact moment has been removed, most likely out of respect for Chao, we know what happened next. As she ended her live stream dance, she began to descend the crane. But as she stepped onto the narrow framework, she slipped. In an instant, she began to fall, 16 stories, with her phone reportedly still in her hand. On the way down, she struck multiple metal beams, her body hitting bar after bar, before she finally crashed to the ground. She died instantly. The stream continued. I can't even begin to imagine what it must have felt like to be watching that live stream in real time. To witness someone laughing and dancing one moment, and then plummeting to their death the next. And honestly, I think it's a good thing that the moment of her fall has largely been wiped from the internet. Even with the most disturbing frames removed, this still remains one of the most haunting live stream accidents ever captured. An unthinkable end to a young woman whose life and career were only just beginning. And in the history of the Douyin platform, Chao Kui-mei is far from the only one. It's tragic how these things happen, so sudden, so unexpected. But what's even more shocking is what we're about to see next. There was really nothing else like it. This obscure 27,000 square foot structure allowed visitors to step into what must have felt like another dimension. It was an art installation known as Dream Space, the brainchild of British artist Maurice Agis, a 74-year-old visionary who had spent his life obsessed with creating massive, surreal environments. And this was his magnum opus. The structure was inflatable, something like a giant bounce house, but far more elaborate. Once inside, visitors were met with a twisting labyrinth of vibrant colors and undulating walls, a psychedelic maze of inflatable tunnels and glowing chambers that invited people to lose themselves inside it. Dream Space first debuted in 2004 and, thanks to its inflatable design, was built to travel. It toured several major cities in the UK before eventually arriving at Riverside Park in Durham on June 22, 2006. The very next day, 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings visited the park with her husband, her daughter, and her 14-year-old grandson. Upon spotting the unusual, alien-looking structure in the distance, her grandson became immediately intrigued. Without hesitation, he kicked off his shoes and ran inside, eager to explore. The rest of the group was more hesitant, unsure of what exactly Dream Space was. But after a moment, Elizabeth decided to go in after him, wanting to keep an eye on her grandson and enjoy the experience with him. Before entering, she turned back to her husband and daughter, smiled, and joked that she was heading in to find peace and serenity. Outside, her husband and daughter sat at a nearby table, enjoying a quiet cup of tea and chatting about the events of the week. But as they spoke, Elizabeth's husband noticed something strange. The Dream Space structure appeared to be lifting off the ground. Watching it rise, he laughed and said, "Oh, it's a ride. I wish I'd gone on it." His daughter turned to look, but her smile quickly faded as she saw what was really happening. With a cold sense of dread, she replied, "It's not a ride." In that moment, Dream Space had snapped loose from its moorings. A massive gust of wind had caught beneath the structure, lifting the entire installation into the air like a balloon. Maurice Agis, who had been standing near the entrance, immediately grabbed hold, trying to anchor the structure to the ground with his own hands. But it was hopeless. Dream Space was already airborne. Agis lost his grip and was thrown backward, crashing to the ground, as he stared up at his life's work now floating 30 feet above him. Inside the structure, there were around 30 people, including families with young children, now being violently tossed around in the air, trapped inside what had suddenly become a giant, inflatable death trap. The scene is difficult to imagine, The enclosed space, the dizzying colors, the sound of screaming children, all of it creating a nightmarish sensory overload. Witnesses would later describe it as one of the most horrifying events they had ever seen. Dream space remained airborne for over a minute before it finally collapsed, crashing down into a nearby parking lot. The scene it left behind was described as a field of bodies. Many of those inside were injured, though thankfully not seriously. But not everyone was so lucky. Among the survivors was a 7-year-old girl who later spoke about what she saw. It was very scary. People were screaming. I saw a lady clinging on, and then she fell. She was lying on her back, and people were around her. I think she died. That woman was most likely 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings. She had been ejected from the structure mid-air, suffering catastrophic injuries that she did not survive. The other fatality was 38-year-old Claire Firmedge from Chesterla Street, who had entered the structure with her 2 young children. They survived. She did not. The video of the incident is deeply unsettling, and though some have pointed out that it could have been even worse, considering how many people were inside at the time, the damage was still profound. 2 lives were lost. Dozens more were physically and emotionally scarred, especially the children, many of whom will never forget what they witnessed. So how could this have happened? The answer lies in a deadly combination of factors. That day had been unusually warm, which likely caused the air inside the structure to expand, creating a hot air balloon-like effect. When sudden gusts of wind picked up later in the afternoon, the inflated dream space acted like a sail, catching the wind and lifting off the ground. In the end, it simply hadn't been secured properly. Shortly after the tragedy, Maurice Aji was arrested and charged with manslaughter. But ultimately, he received only a small fine. He vowed never to create a large-scale installation again. Just 3 years later, in 2009, Maurice Aji passed away. And though he had spent a lifetime creating surreal, immersive spaces meant to inspire wonder, his legacy would be forever defined by a single, devastating moment, captured in one haunting piece of footage. That's all for today, folks. If you want to see more disturbing content, click the video on screen.